D'accord, mes amis, on commence. So, welcome back to Paris Grand Express, Grand Paris Express, Express Grand Paris, Express Paris Grand. I'm very excited about these two workshops, and I appreciate the generosity with which the team is willing to participate in these workshops, as well as our home team players, because giving a prize is great. I think what's particularly interesting about the prize this year is it's fairly early in the project. You've been working on this project for a very long time, but actually it's still early in its inception, its conception. And I'm hoping that this prize will help lift the discourse around that project. And the workshop is a chance to actually talk about that possibility and to sort of work through the possibility of what it means, this project. And it's very important for the school also that it's not just a prize. The people come in, they get their prize, and they disappear. But actually, we find this as a moment for really understanding why it's important and what it's doing. So the workshop, there are two workshops today. The first one is called High Performance Public Transportation. Now, I smile because anyone who listens to public radio in America, especially in Boston, realizes that public transportation, especially in this city right now, is having problems. Right? The subway system in Boston is the oldest in the United States, and it's not running very well. And so this is definitely a moment where we will, I think, learn something and yearn for the possibility of a project like this. This workshop will be broken into two discussions of about 40 minutes in length. The first is on current issues and debates on transportation and mobility, and then the second one is on future models of transportation. There will then be a break, and the second workshop, so if the first workshop is really focusing on transportation and the network, the second workshop is focusing on the urban design component of these stations, and it's called Beyond a Subway, Multiple Dimensions of New Stations as Urban Projects. And that's what's so amazing about the Grand Paris Express is that it's 68 urban projects, really. And that workshop is divided also into two discussions, one on the metro station and its urban context, and then the second on the station as a design object. So the first workshop discussion will be moderated by Saad Boujane, and so I'm going to introduce three people really quickly right now. So Saad is an architect, urban designer, and researcher. He's also a current, we hope, graduating candidate in the Master of Architecture and Urban Design program here at the GSD. Saad received his Bachelor in Architecture with distinction from the American University of Sharjah, where he was the recipient of the Sheikh Khalifa Scholarship. His professional endeavors across North Africa, I should correct myself on that one, the Middle East and the Americas revolves around emerging environmental issues relating to climate change, housing, risk and resilience, and urban design in extreme conditions. And I'm delighted that he's going to be moderating that panel. Before the panel, we're going to have two very short presentations. The first will be a return to the podium by Jean-François Monteils, who is the chairman of the Société du Grand Paris. He's the chairman of the management board and a graduate of the French National Administration School. Where is it? Yeah. He holds degrees in political science and in Oriental languages and civilizations. And so Jean-François will come to the podium. And after Jean-François will be Pierre-Alain Trévelo, who is a GSD alum, foremost. Where's Pierre-Alain? There you are. So Pierre-Alain is a co-founder of the Architecture and Urban Design Office TVK, which is located in Paris. He received his architecture degree from l'École d'Architecture de la Ville et Territoire in Marne-la-Vallée and his MAUD from the GSD. We're very proud of him. He was a co-founder of Tomato, an interesting network of 13 architects. He's taught and lectured widely, and he's returned to Marne-la-Vallée, where he's running the post-professional program in urban studies, urban design. urban design. So we will welcome Jean-François to the podium, and then Pierre-Alain. And just as a final note, I want to tell everyone there is a brochure that goes with the exhibit, so there's a little take-home for people. So if you haven't seen the brochure, please grab one. There's some on the table here. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Okay, thank you, Jean-François. Thank you, Sarah. Very happy to be here. It's very emotional. Hello, everyone. So just a quick start. So now you can use it. You know how to use it. So green light. Yeah. So let me just talk briefly as an introduction about maybe the subject of how large infrastructures plays a great role into the cities, and namely into Paris, and maybe in the idea that it can be a role for sustainability, but also maybe even deeper for ecology into the megalopolis. So let me tell you that, of course, Paris, and you know maybe a little bit Paris, but there's one big event in Paris in the 19th century, which is the last wall of Paris. And this last wall, which has the shape of a circle, is a huge infrastructure. It's a wall 150 meters wide and a non-buildable zone 250 meters wide, so 400 meters wide. And this circle is really like the mental idea of Paris. And there's an inside and there's an outside. And it's really that Paris is in relation with this inside and I would say the rest of the world. So it's also the history of Paris that the suburbs is a bit something that doesn't have the importance that it should have. The modern Paris was really dominated by this wall and by the transformation of this wall. And all these very large infrastructure can transform themselves upon themselves. And you see an image of this wall and another one, an aerial view that shows the tremendous effect that it can have on the territory. And you know the expression, the zone, very much used in French, comes from here. It's the non-buildable zone. So it means that it's something that you don't want to live in. So it's not even a city. It's nothing. It's worse than slums. Then in 1919, we started to demolish this wall. And it was the beginning of this large infrastructural work that never maybe ended. But inside was built the Haussmann Paris during this time, because when you have the wall, you do something inside, and you make a new city, and you make sorry, a new transportation system, the first metro system inside. So it's really about a hierarchical system. When you're inside and when you're outside, it's really not the same life. And at the end of this story, well, it's not the end, of course, but at some point of this story, the wall was turned down and it became this ring road. So the ring road, the périphérique, 35 kilometers long, is also where all the highways arrive, and it's the new formulation of this ring, of this circle, of the French unity, you know, where the country is an hexagon and the central city, the capital city, is a circle. No highway get in. There were projects, but no highway get in, but they all are linked to this ring road. So this map is about large infrastructure, large transportation infrastructure. The pink and the yellow-orange is road infrastructure, highways in pink and national roads in orange. And the green is the railway, but you don't have the subway system here. So if you think about Paris, maybe you think the very iconic houseman Paris. But you have to understand that on the suburbs, the rate of infrastructure of highways is the same as in Dallas. So the number of highways that we have in Paris is enormous. It's very well connected with highways going in all directions. So the number of roads is very important, but they stop on the périphérique. The périphérique was built like this, above and under, and it's a very large snake like this, and it's quite horizontal because it was after the hills. So the hills are inside Paris. Well, some of the hills are inside Paris, and it's make this new geography. But what is interesting also is that this infrastructure is related to the last wall that was made in terms of open space. It's really the new large open space for Paris. And you can see it, of course, when you're on the périphérique, when you're on the road, but actually you can make the comparison with the river. So if you make a drawing of Paris, you would draw the river, and then you would draw this circle. And this circle is a large, and I would say ecological or possible ecological green area, green belt with a highway inside. So there has been work in Paris by the city of Paris, and this time I'm talking about the city of Paris itself, so the 2 million people and the municipality, about what to do with this périphérique. So a few images very quickly about possibilities, like when you have a very big cemetery like this, and the idea that you can bring very new kind of urban places and urban design projects, very much linked to a singular situation. So the public spaces and the urban projects that you can make there are very different from the ones that you would do in the suburbs or inside Paris. And that's what, according to me, is very interesting, because you can have this kind of situation where a building is very specific, is very singular, because it's in relation with the green belt on the left and with the périphérique on the right. So it brings very new typologies, and it brings also new public spaces that can go under the périphérique. They are very much planted with a lot of green space. You can have new kinds of programs that are very difficult to put into the fabric of the cities on the suburbs or inside Paris. Another, this first example was in the northwest of the périphérique. This one is on the eastern part of Paris, and it's a big roundabout. And this big roundabout can become a new square, something that is really a public space as a square. There's the transportation, because you have the Paris subway system existing already, but with the périphérique you can transform it with the idea that it becomes something for the people, because there are so many people crossing from one side to the other every day, and they have to cross the périphérique, which is, of course, not so nice. And once again, the idea that the public space that you make here is very specific. It belongs to this place, and the typologies are new, or can be something that you don't find anywhere else, because you, for instance, covering this roundabout can make a very singular shape. So now, in this history, we arrive to the idea that the Grand Paris Express is arriving. This is a map of all the public transportation without the Grand Paris Express. And you can see the network and the density of the network in the center of Paris. And you have this idea that the regional express network is crossing Paris all the time. So everything depends upon Paris. You have to go through Paris to go to the suburbs. So the Grand Paris Express is going to change that. And that's the main idea, that you come from a very hierarchical system to more and more an anti-hierarchical system, a more horizontal city, a more balanced metropolis, because it's not a city, it's a metropolis, it's even a megalopolis. And the idea is that with this circle that the Grand Paris Express is, once again, the idea of the circle, it's with the same form, you're building another system. So adding a new circle doesn't create a new difference and barrier and hierarchy. On the contrary, it rebalances the forces. And it creates also a relationship, and I want to really stress that very strongly, that it creates a strong relationship with the very specific urban conditions that you find in the suburbs. So once again, this idea that when you think about Paris, and maybe it's something that freezes Paris a little bit, that everyone in the world has its own image of Paris. But Paris is this. If you think about the greater Paris, Paris is this. It's this. It's so many very different conditions, situations, sometimes very old situations, old villages and old conditions in relation to a geography, to a topography, to a landscape. Sometimes, you know, like housing projects and their back gardens. Sometimes small infrastructures crossing the railways, and very difficult streets that you have to overpass and bypass to make your life through this. Sometimes the canals that you can cross, sometimes the big activity or production situations, production fabric, where you have no pedestrian, where it's very difficult to walk, no sidewalks. Sometimes old streets, like this very radial streets that come into Paris, that go very far away into the country. Sometimes the conditions where you have a highway and you have an interchange. And so all of this is the conditions where you will have the stations. The 68 new stations are going to take place in those new, well, not new at all, but they will bring a new life to those existing situations. Another idea is that with this new network, you can also understand from the network, really, different parts of the megalopolis. So it's a bit like coming back. It's not that maybe right as a comparison, but it's a bit like the Rossi's city by parts. It's the megalopolis by parts, but coming from the network that brings very different patterns, you know, figures. Like you can understand that this is Paris in the center, but on the east, the west, or the south, you have very singular patterns, and it also can bring a new pattern from the parts of the metropolis that is on the ground floor, because the subway is underneath, but on the ground floor you will have a life that is depending on this new subway. And all of these very specific conditions, either you take them as a singular point with the 68 station, or you take them as the parts that I've just shown. They are in relation to what the underground is made. And the idea that the underground, the topography and the hydrography, all the terrestrial conditions, they bring to life the idea that Paris is a territory. It's a large territory. It's not like Joan was saying yesterday that in Chicago you have the lake and it's half, you know, of a territory. The other half is the extension of the lake. No, you can spread all around. But this territory is not even. It's not like it's everywhere the same. And it's also about finding maybe possibilities that those stations and those situations, they can create new public spaces. because transportation is about being a public service, being a public space, and to create a public space that is driven by transportation. But our idea is that a public space that is linked to transportation, that is driven by transportation, works when you don't have to use it to be transported. So a real public space needs to be something that you don't have to use transportation to make it work. So that's very strong, I guess, and that's the idea of the Grand Paris Express. It's to create places in the suburbs that are very located, very singular, very much rooted into the suburbs singularity of the spaces that are really terrestrial, I would say. And in this matter, it's a very large infrastructure that can create, of course, sustainability because it's public transportation and it reduces the modality for cars, but also it's sustainable and it's ecological because it creates this relationship with the whole territory. Thank you very much. So, I don't know.
Good job.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Pierre-Alain. The interest of the switch between us is that it allows me to thank you for your attention and go back to my seat because what you said was really fantastic and really interesting, and everybody understands why we are working with guys like Pierre-Alain since the beginning to try to do something clever. I'm just going to give you some short figures to illustrate what is in the law, that the Grand Paris is an urban project, you told about it, based on a new transportation network. Yes, fine. Some figures, as I said, 43 million of daily commutes in all the Grand Paris area. What is probably interesting, the most interesting in it, connected with the Grand Paris Express, is that here you have the links, the commutes inside Paris. Here you have the commutes inside what we call the Petit Couronne, the small ring, which you know now as being the future 15 line. So it's higher than the commute inside Paris. And you have also all the connections between the suburbs and the center, but which are below. Nothing else to explain what a ring is interesting compared to a radial network. Here you have also some figures about the change of use of mobility systems. The development of walking. Now walking is the preferred way of mobility for inhabitants of Île-de-France. And the place of the car is lowering due to a lot of things you are going to discuss during the workshop. This is about spaces, I should say. Let's speak about time. These photographs are interesting. This is the Rue de Rivoli, very well-known road in the heart of Paris. I used to work in the General Audit Office, which is just here. And if you are a good physiognomist, you can recognize me here. But what is interesting is that you cannot recognize my great-great-great-grandfather here. But perhaps you can recognize my daughter here. That's the time we spend during that and that. Not so different, except for the horses, perhaps. Or mine is here. This is very different. Less than one generation. A lot of investment, public investment, to transform that into that. A lot of controversy, we have to say also. Because it's really convenient for people who live somewhere here and goes to the General Audit Office, for example, here. Perhaps a bit more difficult for people who are outside in the suburbs. But anyway, if you don't dare, nothing changes. I tried to be short, so this is the explanation of what Pierre-Alain told you. This is the radial network, this is the ring. These commutes, the most important commutes, are here treated by the Grand Paris Express. But what is important is that we try to do it in intermodality conception. At the end of the new network, 95% of inhabitants of Île-de-France are within 2 kilometers of a station, ours or the ancient ones. And we try to make it possible for them to go there by bike, by foot, and so on. So I just wanted to explain you how it was conceived, with what ideas we tried to develop to conceive the network, and how quickly it changed. I let now the workshop continue. Thanks.
Good afternoon. First of all, I would like to thank Dean Whiting for the opening remarks, and to Jean-François and Pierre-Alain for their poignant introductions that really encapsulate the scope and ambition of the Grand Paris Express and the impact of its solutions to urban mobility and the future of cities, which I believe is incredibly timely. My name is Saad Boujane. I'm a second-year Master of Architecture and Urban Design student hailing from Morocco. And I'm thrilled to be here today to moderate the first of 4 panels this afternoon on the current issues and debates on transportation and mobility. So I'd like to preface with a brief comment or two before introducing our panel. Transportation and mobility are critical components of our daily lives and have a significant impact on the environment, the economy, and society as a whole. In recent years, there have been numerous advancements and innovations in urban planning, policy development, and technology, particularly in relationship to sensors, data, and automation, and all of which are governing how people move in and out of the city. However, there are still many challenges and debates on how to create more sustainable and equitable transportation systems. For example, according to the IPCC, the transportation sector is responsible for approximately 23% of global energy-related CO2 emissions. And as a result, many countries are implementing policies to encourage the use of low-carbon transportation options, such as EV, walking, and public transit, which Jean-François just mentioned. More specifically, this panel discussion will focus on the different global perspectives on urban mobility and what we can learn from successful mobility examples elsewhere, such as the Grand Paris Express, to create more sustainable transportation systems in the North American acumen. So today we have an incredible group of panelists that will shed light on these issues from the architectural all the way to the urban design and planning scales. To my right is our very own Peter Rowe. Peter is the Raymond Garb Professor of Architecture and Urban Design here at the GSD and Harvard University Distinguished Service Professor. He has served as the Dean of Harvard GSD from 1992 to 2004 and the Director of the Urban Design Program from 1985 to 1990. Next is Maurice Cox, trained as an architect and urban planner. Maurice is the commissioner of the Chicago Department of Planning and Development. Cox is responsible for leading the DPD's economic development, planning, and zoning functions, and was formerly the design director of the National Endowment of the Arts under President George W. Bush and President Barack Obama, where he represented the federal government for architecture and design matters. Maurice was also a Loeb Fellow here at the GST in 2005. Then we have Pauline Marchetti. a founding member of Ferrier Marchetti Studio and a professor at l'École Nationale Supérieure des Arts Décoratifs in Paris. She develops a humanist approach to architecture, propounding design and research methods that are based on the sensory dimension of space, volume, materiality, light, and ambiance. And finally, we have Jascha Franklin-Hodge, the Chief of Streets, a title I'm particularly fond of, where he oversees the city's public works and transportation departments. He supports the delivery of high-quality essential city services and works to implement Mayor Wu's transportation priorities, including reliable, affordable transit service, safer streets, design in every neighborhood, and a connected network of low-stress bicycle routes. Chief Jascha previously served as the City of Boston's Chief Information Officer from 2014 and 2018, and has been a visiting fellow at Harvard Kennedy School, focusing on mobility, technology, and public policy. So please, let's have a round of applause for them. So, Peter, I would like to begin a bit more broadly and get your perspective on the Veronica Rudge Green Prize in Urban Design and its ambitions to really bring together all the disciplines from architecture, landscape architecture, urban design, and planning. What do you think of that?
Well, how do you turn this thing on? What? It works?
Yeah.
Okay, good. I'm glad it works. Let me say what I admire about this particular award. I mean, as some of you may know, I was one of the architects of the invention of this prize way back in 1986-87 with Michael von Klemm. I should say that there are about 4 of these I would like to speak to. The first is the sort of sheer scope and ambition of this project. I was astonished yesterday to listen to particularly the French presentations of a political kind, and to understand the enormity of how do you round up 120 different municipalities and one big thing in the middle, to go back to Trévelo's discussion, and make it all work. My hat off to you, monsieur, I tell you. I mean, extraordinary achievement. And the sort of wherewithal and the political will to do that over probably a fairly extended period of time. And by the way, this is still early days for this project, right? You're going to be a little older than you are now, probably, when you get towards the end of it. But I think that's an important thing to bear in mind. More substantively, the 2 aspects I really admire about the project is, first of all, it's the way it addresses social justice. The panel on the wall on this side over here is rather revealing, I think, in the way in which it sort of says, okay, how are these 68 stations going to be distributed, and how is that going to help access in a sort of almost network-free way across the, shall we say, the floor, so to speak, of the Grand Paris. And that's been the ambition, as you described, to make that actually happen from a technological point of view. And I truly admire that, because I think that is the way we have to go. If we're going to deal with questions of diversity and so forth and so on, and belonging, we need to include everybody. And that's what I sort of see this project beginning to do. And I think that's really a great point for it. The other aspect was the one that Trévelo brought up about sustainability. It provides opportunities, because there are a lot of leftover spaces and all of this sort of thing, to do rather neat things with respect to landscape and landscape architecture and so forth, and to diminish the sort of built footprint of the project. And finally, I think the subject, actually, of megalopolises and infrastructure, which I think is the subject of the award, is a very good one. Particularly as we move into the Anthropocene era, and we've got to confront more or less our own fate on Earth, so to speak. I happen to be a sort of object-oriented ontologist, so I sort of think of things that way rather profoundly. And I think we need to get our hands around how to do that better in terms of the stuff we build.
Thank you, Peter. You've also written, co-written, and edited an incredible collection of books, 28 of them to be exact, many of which deal with urban form, historic preservation, housing, and infrastructure in the East Asian context. Could you talk to us a bit more about what has been historically achieved and what are the current trajectories in railway infrastructure in various East Asian cities?
Oh, that's a small topic. Well, let me start with probably the mother of all of the cities. That would be Tokyo in Japan. It has provided more or less the model for rail infrastructural development in East Asia. And essentially it's a ring radial system. And it's been a ring radial system from the get-go. And the get-go was back in the 19th century. So it's not exactly new, but it's a good idea. I see you agreeing with me about that, yes. Basically what happened in Tokyo is an interesting story because it's a bit of a sort of topsy-turvy thing. What happened was during the time in which it was Edo, that was under the shogunate, when Edo became Tokyo in 1868 with the Meiji Restoration, it was sort of beginning to push outside of its bifold development of the upper city and the Shitamachi. The Shitamachi was where probably half the population lived and the other half lived above that in a more sort of capacious kind of a way. It was very, very much a system of location that was defined by class. The daimyos were in the top, that's the aristocrats, and the other hoi polloi, guys like me, were in the bottom, in the Shitamachi, an unequal amount. And of course, Tokyo was automatically a big city because of the Sankin Kotai regulations that the shogunate introduced early on that brought everybody there. So it was almost instantaneously a city of over 1 million people. That's back in the 17th century. It was probably the largest city in the world, actually, at that point in time. So getting out of that, it was sort of pushing against those boundaries. And then, of course, the land shook in 1923 and the whole bloody thing crumbled down with the earthquake. And so what did they do? Well, it seemed to be a good thing for development, right? So the real estate companies became railroad companies and they built railroads out into the Kanto plain in order to locate houses for people. And people ran out there to improve the property values of their house. They could put you on a train to get there. Nevertheless, the ring road was still there because it was developed by the state, Japan Rail actually, and it ran from Shinbashi all the way around. It was actually, originally it was a British invention. So it was they created essentially a spoke and a ring system for Tokyo, right? And then of course, you know, time came and went. And then of course, after the firebombing at the hands of the American Air Force in 1945, it got smashed yet again. So we have Tokyo disappearing twice in a space of about 50 years. And so Ishikawa's plan to rebuild Tokyo adopted pretty much the same sort of model. It was a relatively European model of rings and spokes. And so they rebuilt back the system in order to you know, refurbish Tokyo as a place. I should point out, by that time, the population's risen to about 30 to 35 million people. It's not chump change. It's the biggest system in the world. It's the most used system in the world by far, actually. And, you know, good luck to it. If I move to another place, like, for example, Seoul, Korea, similar sort of things happened, although that happened on the heels of Chung-hee Park, who was a general. He actually was a captain at one point in the Japanese army, and he became the president of South Korea. And in 1971, he decided, well, we need to build a subway. So he started with the first subway line. And then that began to snowball, again following the Japanese model, the Tokyo model of circle and spoke. And indeed, if you look at it now, number 2 line, which those of you from Korea are probably very familiar with, you use it probably an awful lot, is the circumferential one, and there are various spokes on that sort of thing. Then if we move to, for example, Shanghai in China, in the People's Republic of China, it has probably the fastest growing subway system in the world at the moment. They're building something like, 2 lines a year or something. It's sort of crazy in that regard. It's got a population of something like 25 million. So it's, again, a big city. And indeed, they're developing it so that they can produce a net that produces accessibility almost equally across the surface of Shanghai, even with the interruptions of the Huangpu River and what have you. And then finally, probably my favourite town, Hong Kong, right? It also was a case of reform. What happened is it was a rather sleepy town. I remember being a school kid there in the 1950s, and I lived in Kowloon Tong, which was a fairly dense area in the Kowloon Peninsula. And I lived in a suburban house, and my mate, who I went to school with, Henry Chen, he lived about 100 metres away, and the rest of it was sort of green. So it was like almost living in the countryside there. Of course, that's changed very dramatically. One of the biggest changes that occurred was in 1971, the British had the sense to appoint a guy called Maclehose, who was a Scot. The wee Scot came and decided, hey, better fix things up. It's not good what's going on. Because he discovered that everybody in government departments had been turning money back to the government and saying, look, we're doing a great job, have your money back, right? And he's saying, yeah, but we have no education, we have no public services, we have no this, no that. And so he invented the MTR, which is probably economically the most successful subway system in the world. They actually make a profit, in fact, as a private company almost, although they're a government-owned entity. In fact, Stockholm, I think, uses them as a subcontractor to run their subway as we speak. But then what Maclehose did is he said, well, I've got immigrants coming from the north, that is to say, the mainland part of China, and we've got to build and we've got to come up with a model. So he said, right, I'm going to build subway lines and new towns. So in 1973, he created the New Town program of Hong Kong, and so they ended up with this system of spokes, not so much circumferential because of the geography, if you know anything about Hong Kong, with satellites around it, right? So that's the sort of fourth one that I can think of. It's interesting because if I look back at the sort of history of these particular installations, there are 4 or 5 effects that have occurred. One is that, the funny thing about trains is they move in both directions, right? And so in Tokyo, when they put in the Shinkansen, for example, in 1960, in order to service the Olympic Games that they had there, they thought, oh, terrific, we can use the Shinkansen to decentralize Tokyo. Right. It had the absolute opposite effect. Everybody from Osaka was now working in central Tokyo. So a lot of firms moved there, etc., etc. So it was a countervailing kind of force that occurred in that instance. Probably even more profoundly in the Tokyo example is, if you know anything about, if you've ever been to Tokyo or know Tokyo, pretty well everybody works in the centre and everybody lives on the outside. So they have these huge home-to-work trips, massive amounts coming in, right? And of course, the centre was then hemmed in by the 11 original wards, right? Were made of old people and with property rights in Japan closely protected. Nothing could happen. So what did happen? We end up with a centre and a belt made up of 3 big stations. In fact, the busiest stations in the world. Shinjuku, 2 million people, commuters per day. Shibuya, right? Little Shibuya, meaning valley. Right? And then Ikikaburo, right on the Yamanote line, on the circumferential line. So they ganged up and became very, very crowded places. Shinjuku, if you've ever seen the movie My Geisha or something like that, used to be a pleasure ground for the aristocrats, the daimyos of Japan, where they look out over the sea and stuff like that. It then got turned into a reservoir in the 1920s, and then it became the site of some of the tallest buildings a little bit later on. And then, of course, with this gang up with the subway, most of the underground of 1.3 square kilometres, which is not small, is in fact station and station-oriented commerce. So, it was somewhat counterintuitive effect. Then another one in Japan was back in I think it was the 80s, they decided they were going to move all of their research to one place, Tsukuba. The agricultural people moved out there. It's a bit like, you know, in Paris you have a lot of them out in the southwest that this is actually servicing very well. You agree with it? Yeah, I thought I was right about that. And in the case of Tsukuba, they built a line, of course, a subway line back to Tokyo in the hopes that people would move out there. They didn't move at all. They commuted out because they didn't want to give up their expensive properties in Tokyo and take a risk of moving out to Tsukuba. So in fact, it was another one of these countervailing forces that occurred. So I think we need to be, you need to be on guard, you know, about what is going to be the sort of shifts and so forth in population associated with these systems. They're not necessarily the way you think. All right? That's a warning. It's all right. Yeah. We've been there before. He used to be in my class, actually. Now, the other thing that's happened in the Chinese example is China is, you know, likes big, and there's probably a big problem with big. So now in China you have what are called metropolitan regions. And each of one of these weighs in at about 100 million people. Have any of you heard of Jing-Jin-Ji? Jing-Jin-Ji is a combination of Beijing, Tianjin, and Hubei province. And in fact, it's made up of 3 or 4 big cities. And so you have, in a sense, the sort of Parisian model 3 or 4 times over in this area called metropolitan Beijing, which they're trying to treat as a single entity. You also have the Changjiang Delta region around Shanghai, similarly. And you also have the Greater Bay Area, which used to be the Pearl River Delta area, similarly. And then you have Chongqing and Chengdu. So you have 4 or 5 of these things, times 100 million, huge. And you might say, why are they doing this? Well, the espoused reason, and if you read sort of state council documents, which I'm prone to do, is they want to have more control over what's going on. Well, the downside of this, particularly in the Anthropocenic era of greenfield development, is horrible in my view, right? You know, it runs totally counter to the idea of, you know, preserving substantial parts of the earth and making them work better from a metabolic point of view so we can live happily ever after. Hell no! They're going full speed ahead, as far as I can tell, in the opposite direction. And I think that's a real problem with this whole issue of scale.
Thank you, Peter. That was really quite a lot to take in.
Hey, look, I know what I'm talking about. I've been doing this for about 30 years.
I think it's quite interesting to get that global perspective as well. But kind of pivot, like remaining in the planning sort of scale, but sort of shifting to more policy focused perspective. Maurice, as someone who has played a significant role in reimagining and transforming Chicago's development strategies in a way that fosters economic development and inclusive growth, and also in light of President Biden's signing of the infrastructure bill, which actually earmarks $66 billion for rail projects. Could you discuss your perspective on the implementation of railway infrastructure, specifically high-speed rail, in the North American context, including potential benefits, challenges, and planning strategies for ensuring that these types of projects can be successfully and efficiently implemented?
So thank you for the space to talk about that. I came to the jury of the Green Prize from the perspective of a planning commissioner who is overseeing Chicago's largest expansion of their elevated rail system in a generation. And it is, you know, it's a $3 billion project, thanks to President Biden, some of that infrastructure dollars. But it's 4 stations, 4 stations that extends the Red Line to the farthest stretches, southern stretches of Chicago. and it serves, this is a population of about 200,000 people out of 2.7 million who have no access to rail transit. So as I sat on the jury and we talked about all of the various radical ways that the Grand Paris was operating, the perspective I came to it was one of equity, about the ambition of socially reorganizing the city of Paris in a way that addresses not only the wealth gap that we see, but the relationship of the center to the edges and who and how you recenter a city. Because I think of each of those stations as a new center, both a population center, a job center, that in the most radical ways is redistributing the population of Greater Paris. I mean, I think that's extraordinary. And what's extraordinary about it is that it's burrowing underground and no one sees it's coming. So there's a subversiveness in this strategy. I know that must be as well a part of the challenge of trying to communicate a coherent strategy, because it is, as I said, a series of hyperdense centers that are now going to encircle the city. So what also was fascinating to me was using transportation to reset a kind of social agenda. When I started to realize where many of these stations were popping up, I noticed there was an amazing correlation between the amount of social housing that is centered in these areas. Some of the highest concentration of social housing in the greater metro area are in these municipalities. And so if you think back to the civil unrest that we witnessed when the immigrant communities were protesting the injustices of that time, lo and behold, these are landing in some of the very same places that will receive these metro stations. So I don't know if the relationship between the immigrant community, the racial and ethnic mix of those communities, the potential for wealth creation and jobs, which will no doubt follow the transit. I mean, that's the history, whether it's a river or highway or a metro. So what fascinates me is not so much shaving a half an hour off of the commute time or whether you have to go through central Paris or not, but the fact that you actually might be able to work in the municipality in which you live. And that seems to be the grand promise, or the part of the story which I'm really fascinated by. And I'll stop there, but the project has helped me shape what we are going to do in Chicago with our 4 transit stations, which parallel pretty closely the demographics and the dynamics of the 68, the municipalities, 120 municipalities that circle Paris.
Thank you, Maurice. Pauline, Pauline, still kind of remaining in this sort of realm of discussing about discussions around immigrants, your practice is responsible for designing the overarching vision and charter that govern the 68 stations of the Grand Paris Express. More specifically, the principle that you bring into the design of these stations is one of sensoriality and perceptual connections to the built environment vis-a-vis various technological and sensory cues. You also hold the role of being extremely local to the scale of the architecture, and the interior, but still being global to the scale of the city, and how all these stations work in unison, but are still very much independent of one another. Could you please discuss your proposal in greater detail, and how do you plan on catering to the diverse communities of Paris, especially, for instance, in the northern commune of Fort d'Aubervilliers, there are approximately 4,000 ethnic Chinese originating from Guangzhou and roughly 18,000 immigrants from North Africa. How do you go about being very specific in that sort of guideline?
Maybe to explain a little bit the story, we have to go back to China. Well, that's interesting that you introduce the example of Shanghai, because Jacques Ferrier and I, we created a practice-based research studio at the end of the World Expo in 2010. We were the architect of the French Pavilion. So we went there every month for 2 years. Mm-hmm. And when you see how Shanghai changed it at that time, you knew that urban planning has to change in a way. So having that in mind, we came back to Paris and we created a practice-based research studio to try to analyze not only the methodology and the tools we have to use, but also the way you represent what we do and you communicate on what we do in order to involve the inhabitants in the process. So that was the goal of it. And at that time, there is this competition. We did the bid. And it was the competition that we've been asked to think about architecture and design. And we said, okay, if we want to do a project with a vision, we need to address also the issue of creativity and artists. So with us, we brought an artist community in order to answer the question of what are going to be those transitions in terms of architecture. And that's a quite complicated exercise for us, because we were asked to imagine station, but not to design it. Mm-hmm. So you have to totally change the way you do stuff. So you have this practice-based studio, and at the same time, there is this competition, we win, and we have to apply all our ideas. And our ideas was to say, okay, if you take into account sensations and emotions, not only functions, efficiency, then you have a tool, a kind of indicator that could help you imagine the future of a space who has to be very urban, very necessary, because it's an everyday life space. So as an architect, you have to be humble in front of these huge works to do. So we had this this work on the train station, and our tool was the body and the experience. And when you talk about emotion and sensation, this is universal. And that's helped us address the question you asked me, and that helped us created those guidelines in order to say to the architects who actually are in charge of the construction and the design of the train station, be humble with this exercise. Because even if it's in an infrastructure, even if it's a complicated one, there is an issue of not only transporting people, but being the space on an everyday basis, everyday life basis. You know, French villages, you used to meet everyone in front of the church. Afterwards, it was in front of the main city hall. And train station is where you get relationships. It's where people meet. And I think this is crucial because it helps people not to live alone in their own tracks, but maybe to build together a sense of community and a sense of urban, which is not constructive. It's not buildings, it's something else. And we, as architects, we have to accompany this effort. So that's how we managed to, and I hope we did it great, but anyway, the prize says it.
No, thank you so much. You're also constantly attempting to mediate between the natural and the digital by devising this contract where the experience of urban dwellers constitutes the core value of discovering the city's experiences. And as innovations such as artificial intelligence and real-time data-driven structures become intrinsic in the way we experience cities, how do you see technology fit into this narrative and especially into the development of cities in general? And kind of to go back to your idea of the sensoriality.
Oh, we will have a two time-based answer. Mine and my partner Jacques Ferrier, who is going to explain because it's his field of. I did 3 years ago. I did a VR movie based on 3 cities: Marseille, 19th century, old century in Western Europe, New York, and Shanghai. And I did this movie having in mind, I'm going to focus on the experience and the ambience, and I won't say anything about the place, the culture, the time being. It's only about what I can feel at nighttime, with the smell, how you manage to move yourself into the city, what is about climate, the experience of climate, the shadows, the sunlight, etc. And this, I did it with a VR movie, and let's go back to your question, because I had to try my ideas with the new technology. At the very beginning, this movie was, my producer said, it's going to be a two-dimensional movie, the traditional one. And he said, no, with the name of your research-based studio, the Central City, you have to do it VR. And at the beginning, I was like, no way, no VR. I don't understand, because it's everywhere. So you don't control what you show, right. And that's another kind of perspective. So it's interesting if you focus on this aspect of the numeric and the virtual world. It helps us to change the perspective.
Thank you, Pauline. And maybe we can end the panel with Jascha. Your insights will be particularly useful because you work here locally in Boston. And I remember that we had a very good conversation last night that, unlike Paris, Boston is a coastal city, so it's presented with a plethora of climate-related issues that have a direct impact on the city's mobility infrastructure. I was wondering what steps is the City of Boston taking to ensure that sustainable modes of transportation, and equitable ones as well, are accessible to all residents, regardless of income or location?
Yeah, no, it's an excellent question, and as you know, we are coastal, right? So we, I think, are, quite frankly, I think a little late in coming to grips with the implications of that when it comes to how we make sure that the infrastructure we have today, the built environment we have today, can survive and can sustain and continue to support people for decades to come, and to sort of grapple with the urgency of transformation within our transportation system to address the contribution that we are having to climate change. I think the stat that was cited from IPCC of 23% of carbon emissions globally being from transportation. In Boston, they are the second highest source of emissions after buildings. And so we see an urgency in this transformation. And my boss, Mayor Wu, will frame a lot of this conversation in the context of a Green New Deal, because I think for so long the idea of sustainability has been that's a thing for environmentalists, or that's a cost we maybe have to bear, but it's not a thing that helps us as a city, as a community. And what we see as an opportunity here to in this moment where we do need to build, where we need to spend, where we need to rebuild much of our existing infrastructure, we see an opportunity to grow and to thrive and to prosper economically at the same time that we're embracing these kinds of transformations around how we travel as we're rebuilding roadways to, in some cases, literally serve as flood path barriers. These are major, major investments. I mean, this will be billions, if not tens of billions of dollars just in the city of Boston over the decades to come. And so how do we start to rethink these investments so that they can both provide the immediate protection that we need and start to accelerate this shift in modes of transportation? But I want to reflect on sort of one of the dynamics that I think a couple of people on the panel have touched on, and certainly something that we're wrestling with in Boston, which is this intersection of equity and the way in which transportation investments have unexpected consequences. One of the dynamics that we have tried to embrace within the context of the Green New Deal is a focus on investments in the places that have been historically underinvested in. These are often our communities of color. They're places where people have the highest cost and time burdens for transportation, where people lack physical access to jobs and educational opportunities. They're places where people bear a very high environmental justice burden in the form of air pollution. And so we have made it a priority to emphasize our investments in these places. The dynamic that often emerges in these contexts is that we as the city will go in and say, we have $50 million that we want to spend rebuilding this key corridor in this community. And we're frequently met with quite a bit of suspicion and quite a bit of distrust by people who look at this and they say, who is this for? Is this really for me? Like, you tell a good story about how we have not invested here in the past and the burdens we face, but I worry that you build this and someone new comes in because they like these bike lanes, they like these green streets with trees and green infrastructure. They like these places that suddenly feel like places you would want to be and you'd want to linger more than they do today. And so we are really, I think, in many U.S. cities that face the kind of twin burdens of mobility and transportation challenges and housing challenges, housing affordability challenges, are wrestling with what is the toolkit that we can use to both build trust and authentically engage our local communities in the design of these projects and shaping them, and how do we actually pair transportation investments with investments in housing stabilization, with investments in that allow communities understanding that markets will be markets, and in many cases the investments we make in transportation will increase property values, will increase prices. How do we create the connective tissue that allows that financial growth to actually benefit the existing residents of a community? And I'll be the first person to say we don't have the answers to this, but we are trying. It starts with engagement methods around these projects that are not simply planners coming in and saying, this is what you need, but to really figure out how to get people in local communities who are not necessarily the voices we always hear from, the the neighborhood association members who are sort of used to dictating what happens in their community. How do we bring young people in? How do we bring in people, if we're planning a transit project, a bus lane, let's say, or a BRT project, how do we actually ensure that the people who ride the bus today are represented in these rooms? And so we're engaging in more community-led planning processes where we actually will hire community-based organizations, bring members of the community in with learning opportunities that are not just about giving feedback on a project, but about developing their own skills and understanding of the kinds of choices and questions we have in front of us to equip more of them to be meaningful participants in this process. And we are trying to identify the things that are most stabilizing in a community when we make changes that have the potential to be destabilizing. We have a project in Boston along Blue Hill Ave. It's 3.1 miles through the heart of Boston's black community, where we intend to build a bus priority corridor, a bus rapid transit corridor, in a very transit-heavy neighborhood. It's one of the highest transit, it's the highest transit use line in the entire MBTA system. Bus line in the MBTA system runs along this corridor. And we're coupling this with investments in housing stability. The city has identified a number of vacant lots along this corridor and has put out proposals to develop these into permanent, deeply affordable housing opportunities. We're looking at buildings in this area that have instability. They may be affordable today, but they are at risk of becoming market rate housing, and investing some of the money that we have through the COVID recovery funds to help stabilize these buildings to make them permanently affordable. And we're looking at the other dimensions, the next layer of community, because we can talk about housing and say, can you afford to be here? Does your job allow you this? But we're also saying, what are the other resources within this community that are important for the people who are there today, right? Where do they shop? Where do they buy the food? If there's an ethnic community along this corridor, are there the grocery stores that serve them there? Are there community institutions, anchor institutions, whether they be religious institutions or cultural institutions, that are essential to people feeling their home in this place? And what can we do when we make these changes to strengthen these roots that hold people who live there today there, so that they can in fact benefit from the investments that we're making and not simply be eventually the victims of them. And I think this is one of the most sort of profound challenge, and the greater the scale of your ambition, the greater the size of your project, in some ways, the greater the risk for having very unintended consequences. And you know, it's I hope that we will learn from Grand Paris Express about the impacts and the investments they're making, and we will learn from other cities in the U.S. and elsewhere, and learn some lessons of our own about how to do this in a thoughtful and intentional way.
Thank you so much, Jascha. And I think that is the end of our panel. Thank you so much to Peter, Maurice, Jascha, and Pauline for their time. And stay for the next panels. Thank you.
Thank you.